tomorrow, I think I'd probably just kill myself. Like, I don't know
Oh
what
my
I'd
God.
do. Like, I don't know how I'd manage. And I'm like, bitch, you do what you have to do to get through the fucking day. Because if I didn't, play through the pain every day or just, push through every obstacle, I would not exist. I would not be here. So don't tell me like, oh, I don't know how people who become paralyzed or who lose a limb like the Boston Marathon guy uh, go on with their lives after that. Like, and he even got married. Like, yeah,
Oh,
because he's a human being
yeah.
and he didn't want to lay around like a potato. So he learned to walk again and he got married and he went on with a life
Right.
because, like, you are not the sum total of the worst thing that's ever happened to you.
Hmm.
And
Yeah.
you aren't, like, if you believe that you're limited to only being like, well, I guess I'm just stuck now. Um,
Yeah.
you will be, but don't put that on me. Don't put that on other people. What you
Yeah.
think, like, and I don't want to like unless am out here going like, am I not inspiring you? Like, I'm going to be a public speaker on the inspiration speaker circuit.
Yeah.
Don't walk up like, oh, I've had people walk up and do like it's another pet peeve is people will do like super religious people will walk up and do a laying of hands
Oh,
oh,
yeah.
without asking.
Yeah.
Ew. And they'll just come up and they're like, I'm gonna pray that you be healed. And I'm like, one, do not touch me.
Yeah.
And two, I don't need your healing. Like, I have modern medicine, thanks. And 100% of the time they ask for money afterwards.
Oh my God. Yeah, the awesome comedian, Michael Beers, has a joke that isn't really a joke. It's an actual true story where he was just getting out of his car, is what he was doing. And somebody came up to him and was like, there's a special place in heaven for people like you. And he's like, what? There too? Like,
Yeah. It's I mean it follows you
like,
everywhere.
score. Well, that's also like that's another example of infantilization. Like
Yeah.
just assuming that it's okay that you don't have to give your consent before somebody touches you or tries to perform a spiritual act on you. Like that's kind of intimate. Like um no, thanks. But it's taking away it's not even taking away your agency. It's someone showing that they don't think that you have agency in the first place, which I think is a
It's
lot of
that you're
where
you're not
this all comes
capable of
from.
doing
It's
or
the
deciding
idea
for
that
yourself because you
oh, go
are
ahead.
less than.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah,
You
exactly.
are I mean, I did a little bit of
Yeah.
because I
Yeah,
wanted to make sure I
exactly.
had my dates right, a little bit of like historic research on like disabled people in the US.
Mm-hmm.
And so it was legal to forcibly sterilize people with disabilities in the US until 1963. And it is actually still to this day legal to force
Wow.
like sterilize someone with an intellectual disability by parental consent.
Mm.
It's usually like only in extreme cases, but
Wow.
like there's still kind of a genocide going on.
Well, yeah. And that's kind of disgusting to begin with.
Yeah.
Like, if there, you know, is an extreme case where somebody clearly isn't able to give consent to sterilize them, what does that imply about the people doing it?
If you are disabled, you are 10
Yeah.
times more likely to experience gender violence, especially intellectual disability,
Yeah.
like women with intellectual disabilities, and that pertains to things even like trauma, are much higher like rates of like targeted um,
Yeah.
for assault and even long-term victimization, because nobody really listens to them because they aren't seen as, fully mentally capable.
Right. Yeah. And this is something I've been thinking about, like, and it goes back to the education aspect, like, and particularly the sex education aspect. If you are not giving people the basic tools, the basic understanding of how this works, how even their own bodies work, you're basically setting people up to be victimized. If you don't have the language and you don't have the education around what your rights should be, like in an ideal world or situation, and in some cases, these people may not even have some of those rights legally speaking, like what you just said about, parental consent being enough to sterilize an adult in some situations. But if you're not giving people those basic building blocks, they're already going to be at a higher risk to be taken advantage of or hurt.
I mean, you hear of it a lot with people coaching intellectually disabled individuals, saying, it's okay. There's a really famous case from the East Coast. Her name was Anna Stubblefield. She was actually an ethics professor at, I believe, Harvard. And she did this thing, and it was like, she would take a person who was like non-communicative disabled, like severe cerebral palsy was this particular case, and she would use small movements and gestures of this man's to guide. It's called guided writing, and she would communicate for him. Like kind of like a Ouija board. Like she would use his small movements to guide the letters and spell out things. And she claimed that he told her through her interpreting his movements, that he loved her and wanted to do things. And so they had, in quotes, a sexual relationship. But remember, he is basically non-mobile, non-verbal. And so it was really her doing all of the aggressions. Like, she was giving him a blowjob. She laid him out on the floor and had sex with him. And then she says that he wanted to disclose the relationship to his family. So she did. And they were like, whoa, nope. Went to court. And people are still kind of debating this a little bit because, well, one, she was in charge of his caretaking and communication. So really she should not have entered that relationship because that totally violates every ethical boundary of patient provider boundaries. But they also stopped having him do any kind of therapy with any outsider, I guess. So he lost, if he was communicating, that's a big if. If he was communicating, he lost any ability to communicate after that. And if he had consented, then, it was his choice, but we will never know if he did.
Wow.
And it's all a big, like, if people are nonverbal or non-communicative, do they still, like, where do we draw a line?
Right. That's a really very fuzzy gray area. But as with many gray areas, and like, obviously I know that there are a lot of intricacies to a question like this because there's a lot of different people in different situations. But like, I always feel that with gray areas, the best thing that can be done is that this can be talked about.
Right.
Like, the more people are talking about it more often, the more we can start to develop clearer ideas about what constitutes consent in a situation like that. And unfortunately, this topic makes people very uncomfortable and they do not want to talk about it.
Yeah. I mean, there's a lot of cases of women who have been completely paralyzed, like quadriplegics, who then go on to have children, and people are just like, but how?
Mm-hmm.
And you know, there's a lot of, you know, an able-bodied person doesn't get asked the kind of questions that disabled people get asked. Like, people will full on ask you, like, on the street out loud, like, but how does that work?
Right.
How do you do it?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. That's always the question, right? Tell me all of the personal logistical details.
Tell me physically how that functions. Mm-hmm. I am just so curious. I don't have any boundaries.
Yeah,
because you're an object, not a person.
Right.
Yeah.
People use like the veil of, I'm just trying to be more educated about this, or like, I'm just trying to be more woke, you know. That's not up to people with disabilities to do that for you, you know, to tell you how that works. There's a difference between being educated about something and talking about something and violating a person's personal, like, space.
Right.
Yeah. There are all these conversations going around on the internet right now about, like, the vaccine passport and whether or not that's a violation of HIPAA.
Mm-hmm.
And what constitutes, what can you ask a person? Because you can't ask someone, like, if they have a service animal, what the service animal is for. Because that's rude.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. Well, there's like this whole idea that, like, me as the normal person can ask you as the quote not normal person anything that I want, because you are not really a person with feelings to me. You are the other, and therefore you, to me right now, you are my source of education and information.
Yeah. And people just, like, they're I don't know if it's insecurity about the whole vaccine thing or what drives them to be like, I demand to know, like, what your accessibility issue is. Like, why do you get to do this and I don't? Or why do you get to have your dog in the store with you, but I don't?
Yeah.
Like, why can't I bring my peacock on this plane?
Yeah.
Right? But you can bring your cat. Like, what's the difference? And then you have to explain to me what's wrong with you. And like, what's a violation and what's not? Why is a vaccine passport not a violation, but asking me what my service animal is for is?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
And, like, I'm like, it's very clear that y'all don't think about these things on a daily basis.
Right.
Because when it comes up as you know, might be affecting you, you get really aggressive and hostile, but, like, this affects us every day.
But it's also, like, very much, like, inherently putting the other person, like, the person who is demanding this information, is automatically putting the other person on the defense.
It's like inherently passive.
Yeah, I mean, it's called a microaggression, but it's not micro at all, and it definitely does not feel that way.
Yeah, and it puts a lot of pressure on us to disclose information that we may or may not want to be public.
Mm-hmm.
Like, I talk pretty openly about most of my issues. I mostly do. Like, I've had a few things that I just wasn't ready to talk about at the time that were reasons that something was happening, and people were like, but explain. I'm like, that's my very personal medical information.
Mm-hmm.